flight that was meant to be ordinary carried a secret none of its passengers could have anticipated. And before the wheels touched the ground, it would ignite a story that spread far beyond the cabin, tearing down assumptions and forcing people to face truths they had long ignored. In the middle of wealth and privilege sat a child everyone dismissed, judged, and tried to push away. Yet that same child would become the reason silence fell, trust was rebuilt, and a legacy was born in a way no one could have predicted. Like this video, subscribe for more, and share in the comments your thoughts on the story and where in the world you're watching from. On a flight from Boston to Los Angeles, the atmosphere was charged with quiet entitlement, the kind of hush that comes when leather seats, champagne glasses, and wealthy passengers believe they own the skies. In Seat 2A sat Ethan Hale, the 9-year-old son of billionaire tech mogul Richard Hale. Ethan was pale, fragile, and unable to cope with the pressure of the cabin. His meltdown came without warning, a storm of fists pounding against the tray table, tears streaming down his face, his knees pulled tightly to his chest as if he wished to disappear. The cabin filled with sharp gasps and mutters of irritation. A man in business class shook his head, muttering, "If the kid can't fly, he shouldn't be on the plane." The whispers quickly turned to groans, then louder complaints, and soon phones were held high, recording the scene for an audience beyond the cabin. A flight attendant approached, voice like steel. "Sir, control your child or we're turning this plane around." Richard froze, guilt and helplessness etched in his features, one hand clutching his chest as if the shame itself was suffocating him. "That's my son," he said quietly. "He's not broken, he's just overwhelmed." But no one cared, no one listened. The eyes of privilege glared at him, impatient, unkind. And then, from the back of the plane, a voice emerged, soft but steady. "Let me help him." Heads turned sharply. From row 30, a black boy no older than 10 began walking down the aisle. His hoodie was worn, his shoes scuffed, his skin dark as night, and his face expressionless yet resolute. His name was Malik Johnson. He was traveling with his grandmother Ruth, carrying foil-wrapped sandwiches in her handbag, far removed from the champagne and silver trays of the front cabin. Whispers rippled through the rows as Malik walked forward. "Who let him up here?" one woman sneered, clutching her designer purse tighter. Another hissed under her breath, "He doesn't belong in first class." A man in a crisp suit chuckled loudly enough for others to hear. "This isn't a street corner, kid. Go back to your seat." The flight attendant immediately moved to block Malik's path, her face taut with both frustration and suspicion. "Young man, this section is restricted," she said firmly. "Return to your seat." Malik raised one hand, calm but unwavering. "I know what this is," he said, his tone holding no doubt. "Let me sit with him." The passengers scoffed and shook their heads. Some laughed outright at the audacity of a poor black boy daring to cross into their world of quiet luxury. Yet something about his presence unsettled them, because he did not flinch beneath their stares, did not shrink when insulted. He walked with the quiet certainty of someone who had lived through humiliation before and carried it like armor. Richard looked at Malik, confusion clouding his exhausted face. He wanted to object, wanted to protect his son from strangers, but the truth was undeniable. He had no control over the situation. Ethan's screams continued, raw and piercing, echoing through the cabin as though the plane itself might split under the weight of them. Malik stepped closer, ignoring the glares and whispers, until he stood just beside Richard's seat. He crouched slowly, bringing himself to Ethan's level, his voice dropping into a soothing whisper. "It's okay," Malik said, placing a gentle hand on Ethan's back. "I'm here now." For the first time in 37 long minutes, the cabin grew silent. Ethan's sobs softened, his breathing slowed. The passengers, who only moments earlier had judged, ridiculed, and sneered, now watched in stunned disbelief. A child they dismissed for the color of his skin, for the poverty stitched into his clothes, had done what wealth, authority, and status could not. But silence did not mean acceptance. From across the aisle, a woman leaned toward the flight attendant, her voice sharp. "Is he even supposed to be here? Check the manifest. He doesn't look like first class." Another man added, louder this time, "Yeah, are we just letting anyone wander up now?" What's next? He'll start begging for money. The cruelty stung, not because it was new, but because it was familiar. Malik had seen it before, in classrooms where teachers underestimated him, on playgrounds where kids mocked his skin, in stores where clerks followed him like a thief. But he never flinched. He kept his hand steady on Ethan's shoulder, as if to say, "This isn't about me. This is about him." Richard, stunned by the change in his son, found himself speechless. He wanted to thank Malik, but his voice faltered under the weight of disbelief. The flight attendant hesitated, torn between enforcing protocol and acknowledging the truth before her eyes. Malik had calmed Ethan, yet his very presence in first class was treated as a crime. "What are you doing to him?" Richard finally asked, his voice low but trembling. Malik's eyes flicked up, calm and clear. "You're too close. Your panic is making it worse. Step back." Richard blinked, as if struck by something he couldn't comprehend. Step back? He had spent years trying to control every aspect of his son's life, to solve every problem with money or authority. But this boy, dismissed as nothing by the passengers around him, had seen what he could not. Richard did as Malik said. He stepped back. And as he did, Ethan's sobs lessened further, his small body finally relaxing against the seat. The murmurs of the cabin turned to uneasy silence. Even those who doubted could not deny the visible change. For the first time in hours, Richard felt a spark of something he had not felt in years. Hope. The black boy in the worn-out hoodie had succeeded where the billionaire father had failed. Yet even in that moment of quiet triumph, Malik was not free from scorn. Behind them, a man whispered bitterly, "He's probably doing this for a video. Watch your bags." The silence that fell after Malik touched Ethan's shoulder did not last long, because even though the boy's cries had softened and his body no longer shook with panic, the cabin had not changed its opinion about who Malik was or where he belonged, and the voices began to rise again, sharp and cutting like blades slicing through the thin air at 30,000 feet, reminding him of every time he had been told he was less than others, simply because of the color of his skin. A woman in a pearl necklace leaned toward her husband and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear that this was unacceptable, that a barefoot black boy had no business in first class, and her husband grunted in agreement, muttering that the airline had clearly lost control. A businessman 3 rows up scoffed and raised his whiskey glass as though mocking the entire situation, remarking that the boy must be looking for attention, probably hoping for a free upgrade or a viral moment. The flight attendant, clearly flustered by the mutiny brewing among the privileged passengers, turned toward Malik with an uneasy mix of suspicion and obligation, repeating firmly that he needed to return to his assigned seat in the economy cabin. But Richard Hale, who had barely spoken except in fragmented whispers, suddenly found his voice, though weak and trembling, and said, "No, let him stay." The entire row turned their heads in disbelief, their eyes widening as if they could not process a white billionaire defending a poor black boy against his own peers. And for the first time, Richard felt the shift of weight, the recognition that money and status could not buy what Malik had given in a single touch: calm, safety, relief. Malik ignored the murmurs, choosing instead to focus on Ethan, whose breathing slowed, but whose eyes darted nervously as though the echoes of judgment still reached his fragile mind, and Malik whispered, "You're safe. No one here can hurt you while I'm with you." Ethan blinked, his body releasing tension in small waves, and for a brief moment he leaned toward Malik instead of his father, a gesture that sent another ripple through the cabin because it symbolized trust freely given to someone the passengers had deemed unworthy. The backlash came swiftly because prejudice never sleeps. A man in khakis leaned over the aisle and sneered, "Where are your parents, kid? You think you can just wander into this cabin because you feel like it? Go back where you belong." Malik kept his voice calm, his eyes steady, and replied softly but firmly, "I belong wherever someone needs me." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, though few wanted to accept them. Ruth Johnson, Malik's grandmother, sat at the back clutching her Bible and praying silently, her heart racing with both pride and fear, knowing too well the world had never made space for boys like her grandson unless they fought for it. And now here he was, standing in the center of privilege, not with fists or anger, but with quiet courage. Richard's chest tightened as he watched the scene unfold because he realized the hypocrisy of the cabin. These same people who paid thousands for their seats preached about civility, class, and education. Yet when faced with real compassion, they recoiled because it came wrapped in black skin and worn clothes. The flight attendant tried again, her voice strained, insisting Malik must return to his assigned seat for safety and protocol. But Richard raised his hand, this time more firmly, and said, "No, he stays. My son is calm because of him." Gasps spread through the cabin, as though he had broken an unspoken rule. A billionaire siding with a boy from the other side of the tracks, and one woman snapped, "This is ridiculous. You're letting a stranger touch your child midair. Are you insane?" Richard looked at her, then back at Ethan, then at Malik, and whispered, "He's not a stranger. He sees him." The word stunned even Richard because he realized in that moment he had never truly seen his own son beyond the diagnosis, beyond the meltdowns, beyond the embarrassment of public scenes. Malik's hand stayed steady on Ethan's back, his voice low and soothing as he said, "Breathe with me. In and out. No one can rush you. Not here." Ethan's small shoulders rose and fell in rhythm, slowly sinking with Malik's pace. And for the first time since the flight had taken off, peace settled over the child. Still, prejudice fought to reassert itself. The businessman with the whiskey barked loudly that he had paid thousands for this seat and had no interest in watching a street kid babysit, demanding the crew do something. The cabin buzzed with tension, but Malik did not move, his focus unshaken. Because for him, this was not about proving his worth to strangers. It was about protecting Ethan from the storm of judgment he himself knew all too well. Richard looked down at Malik, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions, gratitude mingling with shame, and asked quietly, "What's your name?" Malik did not look up, his hand still firm on Ethan's shoulder as he answered simply, "Malik Johnson." Richard nodded slowly, tasting the name like it was something he should remember, something important, because in that moment Malik was no longer just a boy in a hoodie. He was the bridge between chaos and calm, between privilege and humanity. He was the founder of an empire, a billionaire whose app reshaped industries, a man who commanded boardrooms with a whisper. Yet now he felt smaller than the boy beside his son, smaller because all his wealth had not bought him this simple gift of calm. Malik, by contrast, came from a world that had no golden doors or red carpets, a world where his grandmother Ruth packed peanut butter sandwiches in foil, stretched dollars until they screamed, and prayed nightly that the world would not break her grandson before he had the chance to grow. In row 32, they had boarded quietly, unacknowledged, overlooked, the flight attendant barely sparing them a glance, while champagne had been poured effortlessly up front, slippers handed out with smiles that carried the ease of service for the powerful. Now Malik stood not as a passenger, but as a challenge to every unspoken rule the cabin lived by, because in their eyes first class was a fortress built to keep boys like him out. The whispers grew sharper. "He doesn't belong here," one woman hissed. "Look at his clothes," another muttered, clutching her designer tote tighter. A man scrolled on his phone and smirked, remarking to his seatmate that Delta had clearly lowered its standards if street kids could wander into premium cabins. Malik heard it all, every word pressing against him like the echoes of his life beyond the plane. Teachers doubting his intelligence, shopkeepers watching him like a thief, children taunting him on playgrounds where his skin was called a curse. Yet he did not retreat. He focused on Ethan, whispering gently, "Breathe, little man, you're not alone." And his words, though quiet, carried more authority than the passenger's prejudice. Richard's eyes darted between Malik and the others, a strange realization dawning that while he had spent his life building walls of status to keep the world at bay, Malik was tearing down walls simply by being present, by refusing to shrink before the glares. And yet Richard could not ignore the tension in the cabin, the way passengers shifted uncomfortably, the way the flight attendants whispered nervously about protocol, about liability, about order. He was used to control, but here he was powerless, and that made him both terrified and oddly relieved, because for once someone else held the answers. Malik was steady, but inside he felt the sting of every stare. He knew this feeling too well. At school he was always the boy assumed to be trouble before he spoke. At stores he was always the boy shadowed down aisles. At playgrounds he was always the one pushed first and blamed last. His grandmother had told him, "The world will see your skin before it sees your soul." And as he knelt beside Ethan in a cabin dripping with quiet wealth, her words rang true. But he also remembered her saying, "You are not here to prove your worth to them. You are here to carry light where they see only shadow." That was why he kept his hand steady on Ethan's back, why he let the insults slide past him, why he whispered softly as if shielding Ethan not just from noise, but from a world that never stopped judging. The gulf between Malik and Richard was not only one of money, but of expectation. For Richard had been raised to believe the world owed him a seat, while Malik had been raised to believe he had to fight for every inch. Yet here they were, both fathers in their own way, one biological, one by empathy, sitting beside the same boy who needed not wealth or pity but presence. Ethan's small body relaxed further, his head tilting slightly toward Malik, as though the boy's steadiness was more secure than his father's wealth, and Richard felt the sting of shame because it was true. He had spent millions on therapies, on specialists, on devices, yet it was a barefoot black boy who broke through the wall he never could. A businessman in 4D shook his head, muttering that it was a circus, that the airline had lost control, but others began to shift, their eyes no longer as hard, their expressions softening as they realized what their prejudice had blinded them to. Malik was not a disruption, he was the answer. Still, the gulf was there, an invisible line across the aisle. One boy seen as privilege personified, the other as intrusion embodied. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, a reflex of status, and thought about how his world had always been filled with handshakes, contracts, deals sealed over glasses of wine, and yet none of that could help him now. Malik thought about how his world was filled with sideways glances, extra security checks, slammed doors, and yet none of that stopped him from stepping forward. The difference between them was a canyon carved by centuries, but in that moment Ethan became the bridge. The passengers might never admit it aloud, but they saw it. The billionaire's son leaning against the poor black boy, choosing trust not by class or color, but by something deeper. It unsettled them because it broke the hierarchy they believed in. Malik's grandmother whispered prayers in the back, her eyes glistening with both fear and pride, knowing the spotlight could be dangerous, but also knowing her grandson's purpose was never to hide. Richard, watching Malik, whispered almost to himself, "I don't understand how you do this." And Malik finally looked up at him, eyes steady, and said, "I've lived it." The uneasy truce that had settled in the cabin after Malik's calm words did not last, because though Ethan leaned quietly into his presence, the passengers around them could not let go of their indignation that a black boy from the back of the plane had crossed into their world, and their judgment rose sharper with every breath Ethan took. A woman with blonde hair tucked neatly behind diamond earrings leaned forward in her seat, whispering loudly to the man beside her that this was unacceptable, that safety protocols were being ignored, and that the airline had completely lost control. The man nodded, sipping from his crystal glass, his eyes narrowing on Malik, as if his very existence was a threat. Another passenger muttered that he was sure Malik wasn't even on the manifest for first class, and wondered aloud whether airlines now let anyone wander into premium cabins. The venom in their words echoed what Malik had known his entire life, that his skin was a spotlight for suspicion, that no matter how quietly he carried himself, people would always see danger where there was none. Still, he did not flinch. He kept his hand on Ethan's back, whispering, "You're okay, I'm here," as if shielding the boy from the storm of prejudice gathering like thunderclouds around them. Richard, watching the scene unfold, felt the pressure in his chest intensify, because every glare and muttered insult aimed at Malik was also an indictment of him for allowing the boy to stay. And though Richard had spent his life surrounded by powerful people who bowed to his silence, now those same types turned their disdain on him, questioning his judgment, his fatherhood, his worth. The flight attendant's face was strained, caught between enforcing the rigid rules of her job and acknowledging that Ethan was calmer than he had been since the flight began. But rules were easier to defend than compassion. And so she leaned down to Richard, whispering that it would be best if Malik returned to his assigned seat. Richard shook his head quickly, his voice stronger now than before. "He stays. My son needs him." Gasps rippled through the row, as if he had broken an unwritten contract. A white billionaire defending a black boy the cabin had already judged as an intruder. A man 2 rows up muttered bitterly, "He's probably doing this for attention, probably recording it for some stunt." Another hissed to his wife, "Watch your bag." The cruelty did not surprise Malik. He had been watched in stores, accused on sidewalks, questioned by teachers, and dismissed by strangers his entire life. This was no different, except now he refused to retreat. His voice was calm as he told Ethan, "You don't have to fight. Just breathe with me." The boy's small chest rose and fell in shaky rhythm, and the sight was undeniable. Malik's presence brought relief where others had only brought judgment. Yet even that truth could not silence prejudice. The man in 4D, his suit sharp and his voice louder than necessary, scoffed and said for all to hear, "Are we really going to let some kid from Coach babysit a billionaire's son? This is absurd. Get him out." Malik's eyes flicked briefly to the man, but he did not respond. He knew from experience that responding would only feed their fire. So instead he turned his attention back to Ethan, whispering again, "You're safe. I see you." Those words struck Richard like a blow, because he realized he had spent years looking at his son without truly seeing him, measuring progress by therapy milestones and medical reports instead of the quiet truth of presence. Now this boy, dismissed by wealth and whiteness, was teaching him what real vision looked like. Ruth Johnson, from her seat in the back, clutched her Bible and watched with silent fear, because she had seen before how quickly suspicion could turn dangerous, how quickly authority could turn against boys like Malik, and she prayed that this moment would not end with him dragged away for the crime of compassion. But Malik carried himself with quiet defiance, his very stillness a refusal to bow to their disdain, his hand steady on Ethan's shoulder, as though he had built a shield between the boy and the rest of the world. Richard found himself torn between gratitude and shame, his mind racing with every insult he had overheard, every mutter about Malik's skin and poverty, and he realized he had always benefited from a world that gave him the benefit of the doubt while giving boys like Malik the burden of suspicion. The difference was blinding now. The businessman who had sneered earlier raised his glass again and remarked loudly that the plane had become a circus. But this time his words fell flat because some passengers had begun to notice the obvious truth. Ethan was calmer, his cries gone, his breath even, his body leaning gently toward Malik instead of recoiling. Compassion had done what money and rules had failed to do. Still, the tension in the cabin was thick, the air alive with contradiction. Because while some began to soften, others hardened further, unwilling to admit that a barefoot black boy could teach them anything. Richard turned to Malik, his voice low but audible, and asked, "How do you know what to do?" Malik finally looked up, his gaze steady but tired, and answered, "Because I've lived it." Richard sat rigid in his seat, his mind racing as though he had been thrown into a mirror reflecting all the ways he had failed his son. And in the reflection, he saw himself clinging to control, to order, to wealth, while missing the simple fact that his son did not need another solution. He needed someone who could sit beside him without judgment. Malik's hand stayed steady, his voice low as he whispered to Ethan, "You're okay, little man. Just follow me, slow breaths, don't rush." Ethan's chest rose and fell in hesitant rhythm, and for the first time since boarding the flight, his small body stopped jerking violently. The passengers saw it, they felt it, but still prejudice fought to survive. A woman across the aisle muttered that it was reckless, that allowing Malik to stay was dangerous, and another man sneered that the airline would be sued if something went wrong. Their words revealed the barrier Malik had always known, the invisible wall built not of bricks, but of assumptions and fear, a wall that told him his skin, his poverty. His presence in spaces meant for the privileged was a threat before he even spoke. Yet Malik was not here to argue with their prejudice. He was here for Ethan. And so he did what he always did when the world tried to cage him. He ignored the hate and focused on what mattered. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice raw, and asked, "What do you mean you've lived it?" Malik glanced at him briefly, then back at Ethan and said softly, "My brother was like him. Lights, sounds, crowds, it all crushed him. He couldn't speak when it got too loud. I used to sit beside him, just like this." The cabin grew still again, not from compassion, but from discomfort, because the passengers were forced to reckon with the possibility that the boy they scorned had knowledge deeper than any specialist. Knowledge born from experience, from love, from pain. Ethan shifted, his small hands gripping Malik's sleeve, his body seeking the stability that Malik's calm provided. And the sight pierced Richard like a blade because he realized his son was reaching for Malik in a way he had not reached for his own father in years. Richard's throat tightened with shame. He had hidden behind money, behind tutors, behind prescriptions, but his son had always needed what he had never learned to give: stillness, patience, understanding. Malik whispered again, "You don't need to talk. You're safe." The words were simple, but they cut deeper than lectures or therapies because they came from someone who knew what it meant to be unseen, someone who had lived a life where safety was never guaranteed. A passenger finally snapped, unable to bear the disruption of their privilege. The man in khakis, his face red with indignation, barked, "Are we really just letting this happen? He doesn't belong here. Get him out." His words broke the fragile stillness, reigniting the hostility in the cabin, and the flight attendant stepped forward, her voice sharp, insisting again that Malik must return to his seat. Richard turned sharply, his voice louder now. "No, he stays." The words came with finality, with the authority of a man who was used to being obeyed, but this time he was not commanding as a billionaire, he was pleading as a father. Malik looked up at him, his eyes steady but not hardened, and said softly, "You're too close. Your panic is trapping him. Step back." Richard froze, his pride stinging, but something in Malik's tone left no room for ego. He stepped back, his hands trembling, and as he did, Ethan exhaled slowly, his entire body loosening like a knot finally unraveling. The change was visible, undeniable, and for the first time the passengers could not pretend that Malik's presence was anything but necessary. The businessman with the whiskey scoffed again, saying it was luck, nothing more, but his words rang hollow. The truth was right in front of them. Ethan was calm because Malik had broken through a wall no one else could. Richard's heart swelled with both relief and sorrow, realizing that the boy they had mocked had seen his son more clearly in minutes than he had in 9 years. Malik leaned close to Ethan, his voice a whisper almost too soft to hear. "You don't have to fight. Just rest. I've got you." Ethan's hand, small and trembling, clutched Malik's sleeve tighter, a gesture of trust that silenced even the harshest critics. The woman who had muttered earlier now sat back in her seat, her lips pressed together, unwilling to admit she had been wrong, but unable to deny what she had seen. Richard's eyes burned with unshed tears. He wanted to thank Malik, to apologize for the cruelty of the cabin, for the cruelty of the world, but words failed him. Malik did not need thanks. He did not need recognition. He only needed to make sure Ethan felt safe. The barrier between them, race, class, wealth, was still there looming, but for Ethan it no longer mattered. To him, Malik was not a poor black boy, not a stranger. He was safety. He was calm. He was the one person who understood. And that truth began to break the barrier for Richard too. He whispered quietly, almost himself, "I've been looking at him all this time, but I never really saw him." His voice carried the sharpness of entitlement, the kind of tone that expected applause and agreement, but instead it created a heavier silence, the kind that follows arrogance when the room is no longer sure it agrees. Richard Hale turned slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the man who had dared to reduce Malik's courage to babysitting. And for a brief moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the billionaire would retreat into silence or finally push back. Malik did not move, his hand still steady on Ethan's back, his face calm in the face of insults he had known his whole life, insults that had come in different forms in classrooms, in stores, on sidewalks, but that always meant the same thing: you don't belong. He had learned to absorb those words without flinching, to carry them like scars that no longer bled. But this time he was not the only one who heard them. Richard did, and for the first time he felt the burn of shame not directed at him, but at a system he had always benefited from. A system that now turned its teeth on the boy saving his son. Richard rose slightly from his seat, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the air. Security for what? A child calming another child. His words silenced a few murmurs, but the man in 4D scoffed and snapped back that Richard was unfit, that letting some stray from Coach lay hands on his son was reckless, that this wasn't compassion, it was negligence. Malik did not answer. because he had learned long ago that answering men like that only fed their fire. But Ethan's breathing had steadied further, and the small boy now leaned into Malik with trust that could not be denied. That trust, visible to everyone in the cabin, spoke louder than any argument. Still, prejudice clung stubbornly. Another man muttered about liability. A woman whispered about danger, and the flight attendant stepped in nervously, her hands raised, her voice trembling with the pressure of balancing rules with reality, reminding Richard that Malik was not authorized to be in first class, that protocol demanded he return to his seat. But Richard, his patience burned away, snapped back with a voice that carried authority and desperation. That boy did in 5 minutes what 10 therapists and 4 specialists could not do in 5 years. You want me to send him back? For what? So my son can suffer while you feel comfortable. The words stunned the cabin, because they came not as a polished statement from a powerful man, but as a raw confession from a father stripped of pride. The businessman in 4D sneered, mocking that Richard was embarrassed he needed help, embarrassed that a black boy from Coach had succeeded where his wealth had failed, and the laughter that followed from a few passengers was sharp and cruel. But then Malik spoke, his voice quiet but unyielding, cutting through the mockery with the weight of truth. "He doesn't get loud," Malik said, his eyes never leaving Ethan, "but everything in him is screaming." The sentence hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing even those who had laughed, because it was undeniable in its clarity. Ethan was quiet now, but the storm inside him had been real, and only Malik had understood. The flight attendant froze, caught between orders and truth, and the passengers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier judgment exposed for the cruelty it was. Richard's throat tightened, his hands trembling, because he realized Malik had not only calmed his son, but had given words to a pain he had never understood, words that stripped away the excuses he had clung to. The confrontation grew sharper as the businessman demanded again that Malik be removed, raising his voice until others joined in with mutters about order and protocol. But this time voices rose from the other side as well. A woman stood and asked if Malik needed a seat closer. Another man pressed his call button to request a drink for him, and murmurs of support spread as passengers who had once judged now shifted to defense, realizing the truth before their eyes. The tide was turning, but the barrier of race and class still loomed, and Malik knew that even victory here would not erase the suspicion that followed him everywhere. Yet he stayed calm, because Ethan's trust mattered more than their disdain, and Ethan's small hand clutching his sleeve was proof that no insult could erase the truth of what was happening. Richard looked at Malik, his voice breaking with a mixture of gratitude and shame, and whispered, "I didn't know. I thought I did, but I didn't." Malik nodded once, his eyes steady, and replied, "Most people don't. They look. They don't see." Richard swallowed hard, the words burning into him because he knew they were true, and the cabin, though still tense, felt the shift as more passengers began to realize that the barrier they had clung to had already cracked. The confrontation in first class was no longer just about a boy calming another boy. It was about privilege being forced to face empathy, about prejudice being exposed for its emptiness, about a black child standing firm in the face of disdain and proving with action what words could not. And in that moment, for the first time, Richard did not feel like the man in control of the room. He felt like the student, and Malik, the boy they had tried to send away, was the teacher. Ethan's small hand, which had clutched Malik's sleeve moments before, shifted suddenly, reaching across the divide to find his father's hand. And when his fingers curled tightly around Richard's palm, the entire cabin seemed to gasp, as though they had all witnessed a miracle that defied explanation. For years, Richard had tried to coax his son into connection, had spent fortunes on therapies and devices to bridge the gap, but never had Ethan reached for him willingly, never had he initiated the simple gesture of trust. And now here, 30,000 feet in the air, with a poor black boy by his side, he had done it without a word. Richard froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes burning as the weight of the moment sank in, because this was not only a father and son's first touch of reconnection, it was proof that his own blindness had kept him from what his son needed all along. The passengers, many still clutching their champagne flutes and designer bags, could not deny what they saw, though some shifted uncomfortably because it shattered the hierarchy they clung to. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, while another muttered that it was beautiful but still unsafe, refusing to let go of suspicion even in the face of a miracle. But the cabin's energy shifted nonetheless, because prejudice had been forced to watch trust bloom where it had no power to stop it. Malik said nothing, his hand still steady on Ethan's back, his eyes calm as though he knew this was what he had been waiting for, that the boy was ready to let his father back in. Richard's hand trembled as he closed his fingers gently around Ethan's, terrified of breaking the fragile trust, but desperate to hold on, whispering, "I'm here, buddy. I've always been here." Ethan did not answer, but the squeeze of his hand was enough, and the silence that followed was not the cold silence of privilege, but the sacred silence of recognition, of connection, of breakthrough. Malik finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. That's his way of saying he trusts you again. The words hit Richard like a wave, his tears spilling freely as the truth sank in, because he realized this trust had not been earned by power or wealth, but by empathy, and it was Malik's presence that had made it possible. The cabin, so quick to judge and mock before, now shifted uneasily, some ashamed of their earlier cruelty, others resentful that a boy they had dismissed had proven them wrong, but all of them unable to deny the truth before their eyes. The businessman in 4D muttered under his breath, trying to reassert his authority, but his voice lacked the bite it had before because the power of the moment had stripped him bare. The flight attendant, who had insisted repeatedly that Malik return to his seat, now stood frozen, her eyes softening as she realized that protocol meant nothing in the face of what she had just seen. For the first time, she whispered not to Richard, but to Malik, "Would he like a blanket?" Malik nodded once, and she gently draped it over Ethan's legs, her earlier suspicion replaced by quiet respect. Richard looked at Malik, his voice hoarse, and said, "Thank you." Malik shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank him. He chose you." The simplicity of those words cut through the billionaire's soul, because they revealed a truth he had refused to face. He had been waiting for money, specialists, and outsiders to fix his son, when all his son had wanted was to be seen, to be trusted, to be given space. Ethan's hand still gripped his father's, his breathing calm now, his eyes closed but peaceful, and Richard felt as though a door had finally opened after years of being locked from the inside. Malik leaned back slightly, giving father and son space, but his presence remained like a shield, a silent witness to the connection that privilege had failed to create. The passengers whispered among themselves, some already reaching for their phones to capture the moment, others simply staring, conflicted between their prejudice and the undeniable truth of what they saw. Ruth Johnson, from her seat in the back, clasped her Bible tighter, tears streaming down her face, whispering prayers of gratitude that her grandson had not only helped a child in pain, but had forced a world of privilege to witness the power of compassion. Richard, overwhelmed, whispered again to Malik, "How did you know?" Malik met his eyes and answered simply, "Because I listened." The words were devastating in their clarity, because Richard realized he had never truly listened to his son, only managed him, corrected him, or tried to control him, and it was that failure that had built the wall between them. Now, because Malik had listened, Ethan had reached across that wall, and the breakthrough was undeniable. One woman leaned toward the aisle, her tone dripping with doubt, and asked loudly enough for several rows to hear if Malik was some kind of therapist in training, or if this was an orchestrated social experiment designed to make them feel guilty. And another man sneered that it had to be staged, because no barefoot black boy in a hoodie could simply walk into first class and do what 10 years of professionals could not. Richard opened his mouth to snap back, but Malik spoke first, his tone steady, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not a therapist, and this isn't an experiment. I had a brother." His voice carried through the cabin with a quiet force, and the words silenced even the most skeptical, because there was no script in his delivery, no performance, only raw truth. The passengers leaned back, some frowning, others lowering their eyes, as Malik continued, his hand still resting gently on Ethan's back, as though the boy's calm was more important than defending himself. "My brother couldn't handle loud sounds, bright lights, crowded rooms. He couldn't speak when the world pressed too hard. I used to sit with him like this until he passed." The last words landed like a blow, heavier than any insult, heavier than any judgment, because they carried grief that no child should have had to bear. And for the first time, the cabin truly saw Malik not as an intruder, but as a boy who carried scars deeper than his worn hoodie. Richard inhaled sharply, his throat tight with a mix of sorrow and gratitude. Because in that moment he understood that Malik's strength was born from pain, from years of listening and loving someone the world dismissed. And it was that lived truth that had broken through to Ethan when all else had failed. Ethan's fingers tightened around both Malik's sleeve and his father's hand, as though he understood too, as though the spirit of Malik's brother lived in the calm he now felt. Some passengers shifted uneasily, ashamed of their earlier words, while others clung stubbornly to suspicion, unwilling to let go of prejudice even in the face of Malik's honesty. The man in 4D muttered again that it was still reckless, that grief did not equal training, but his words lacked conviction now, his authority stripped away by truth too raw to deny. Ruth Johnson, from the back of the plane, closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of both sorrow and pride, because her grandson had spoken his truth not with bitterness, but with dignity, forcing the world to hear what it had tried to ignore. Richard leaned closer to Malik, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Malik looked at him, his eyes steady, and said softly, "Most people don't ask." Those words pierced deeper than any insult, because Richard realized he had never asked about the lives of those he dismissed, never wondered what burdens they carried, never thought to see beyond the surface. The cabin was quiet again, but it was not the hostile silence of before. It was a silence born from reflection, from the heavy weight of truth that could not be erased. A woman who had earlier demanded Malik be removed now spoke softly, almost to herself. He understands because he's lived it. And her words spread through the cabin like a ripple, softening faces, loosening clenched jaws, replacing hostility with something closer to humility. Ethan exhaled again, his body steady, his trust unbroken, and Richard felt tears spill as he realized how blind he had been, how much his son had needed someone like Malik, someone who knew without being told. Malik finally shifted his eyes to the passengers, not with defiance, but with quiet strength, and said, "He's not spoiled. He's not broken. He's surviving. You call it meltdown. I call it fighting to breathe." The words struck the cabin like thunder, stripping away every excuse, every prejudice, every insult that had been hurled earlier, because in that moment they could no longer pretend they did not understand. Richard lowered his head, ashamed of the times he had thought the same words himself, ashamed of how he had failed to listen. Ethan leaned his head against Malik's shoulder, the barrier of race, class, and wealth shattered by the simplest truth of empathy. And for the first time, Richard understood that his son's world had always been filled with noise and pain, and that he himself had been part of the problem by demanding control instead of offering presence. The confrontation earlier had been about Malik's right to be there, but now it was about his right to be heard, his right to speak truth born from lived pain, and no one could take that away from him. Even the businessman in 4D fell silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes darting away as if ashamed to meet Malik's gaze. Richard whispered, almost to himself, "I built an empire teaching machines how to listen to data, but I never learned how to listen to my own son." By the time the wheels touched down at LAX, the video had already been shared hundreds of thousands of times, and reporters waiting at the gate were no longer there for celebrities or politicians, but for a barefoot black boy in a hoodie who had silenced an entire cabin with empathy. The passengers filed out of the aircraft in awkward silence, some avoiding cameras, others pretending not to recognize the boy they had mocked only hours earlier. But Malik walked steadily beside his grandmother Ruth, his head held calm and unshaken. Richard followed with Ethan clutching his hand, his mind overwhelmed not only by the viral storm outside, but by the realization that his life had been permanently changed in the quiet aisle of an airplane. Flashbulbs erupted the moment they stepped into the terminal, voices shouting questions that carried more chaos than the flight itself. Was it true Ethan was autistic? Was Malik trained? Was this staged? Was Richard embarrassed? What had really happened? Richard tried to shield his son, but Malik stood still, his calm presence unbothered by the swarm. And when a reporter shouted, "How did you know what to do?" he answered simply, "Because I've lived it." The silence that followed that sentence was deeper than any applause, because it stripped away speculation and left only truth. Richard stepped forward to the microphones, his voice breaking. "I'm Richard Hale. Yes, I built a tech empire, Yes, I've spent millions trying to help my son communicate. But this boy, this stranger, helped him say more with silence than anyone else ever did with words. The crowd erupted with questions, but Malik said nothing further, and Ethan, still clinging to his father, buried his face in Malik's sleeve, a gesture that cameras captured and spread worldwide within minutes. By nightfall, the clip had crossed 70 million views. News anchors called it a miracle. Commentators debated whether empathy could be taught or if it was born through pain, and hashtags exploded with parents of autistic children sharing their own struggles, many saying they had waited years to feel seen like this. Richard's phone rang endlessly with requests for interviews and speaking engagements, but he declined them all, telling his assistant that this was not about business, not about publicity, but about something real. He gave only one instruction: find him. Not for press, not for a deal. I owe him something real. When they located Malik, it was not through social media, but through a school counselor in Atlanta who replied with 2 words, "That's Malik," and included a link to a small fundraiser titled, "Help Malik Attend His Late Brother's Favorite Art Program." The total raised was $78. Richard read the page in silence, his chest tightening with both shame and resolve, because the boy who had given his family more than money could buy had asked the world for so little, and even that had gone unheard. The next day, Richard flew to Atlanta. No cameras, no entourage, just himself. He waited outside the school until the final bell rang, watching children pour out laughing and running, until finally Malik walked through the gate, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face calm as ever. Richard stepped forward, holding out an envelope, his voice unsure. "For you. College, clothes, wherever you wanted to go." Malik looked at the envelope, but did not take it. "I don't want money," he said quietly. Richard blinked, caught off guard. "Then what do you want?" Malik met his eyes and answered firmly, "I want a room where kids like Ethan don't have to scream just to be heard." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of the request sinking into him. "You mean a center?" Malik shook his head. "I mean a sanctuary. No white coats, no clipboards, no one telling them they're broken. Just peace." Richard nodded slowly, the decision forming in his chest before he could even speak. "All right, you'll design it. I'll fund it." 3 days later, the announcement was made. The Johnson Center for Quiet Communication, a fully funded sensory support hub in Atlanta, free for any family navigating autism. The reaction was explosive. Supporters hailed it as groundbreaking, but critics mocked it as emotional PR. Talk show hosts sneered that a billionaire was pandering to a barefoot kid, and bloggers wrote dismissive articles about unqualified activism. But then the footage resurfaced, not just from a plane but from classrooms where teachers played Malik's words to students who finally understood themselves, from living rooms where parents cried as they shared the clip with their children, and the backlash began to collapse under the weight of lived truth. Delta Airlines announced an internal review. The flight attendant who had tried to block Malik was reassigned, and the man in 4D who had mocked him was identified, losing a major speaking engagement at a business convention the following week. He issued an apology on social media, writing that he had reacted poorly and since learned more, but no one retweeted it because the world was no longer listening to his voice. The spotlight was on Malik, though he never sought it, and on Ethan, who had become the face of a national conversation about empathy. Invitations poured in from the White House, from conferences, from media outlets, but Malik declined them all, sending only a handwritten note that said, "If we want to reach the ones who don't speak, we have to stop talking over them. Start sitting beside them." Richard read the note aloud at a tech summit, setting down the microphone afterward with tears in his eyes, confessing to the audience, "I used to build for billions of users. Now I build for one child at a time." The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but Richard knew the true applause belonged to Malik, whose quiet act had grown into a movement. At the center's opening 6 months later, there were no red ribbons, no flashy speeches, just a wooden sign that read, "You don't have to explain yourself here." The Johnson Center had been open for only 6 months when its quiet halls began to ripple outward into the world beyond Atlanta. Because what started as a sanctuary born from one boy's request on a flight was becoming a movement that challenged how people thought about communication, about empathy, and about what it meant to listen. Inside the center, children who had once been silenced by overwhelming noise or dismissed, as Broken began to flourish in small ways that felt like miracles to their families. A boy who never removed his headphones finally took them off for an afternoon and smiled at the sound around him. A girl who had been told not to waste paint filled entire walls with colors that expressed her feelings, and for the first time nobody stopped her. And Ethan Hale, once defined by panic attacks and silence, began stringing together words, small at first, but steady, asking Malik one day if he wanted juice, and then laughing when Malik blinked in surprise. Richard visited often, no longer with cameras or assistants, but as a father who had finally learned that his presence mattered more than his power. And each time he watched his son grow, he felt the shame of his past blindness, but also the hope of knowing it was never too late to change. Malik never sought recognition, he never asked for headlines or awards. And when a major university offered him an honorary degree, he quietly refused, saying that his late brother never got a chance to earn one, and it would feel wrong to wear something his brother never could, because Malik's purpose was not to climb ladders built by others, but to sit beside those who had been left at the bottom. Reporters came often, hoping to capture sound bites or create narratives of heroism, but Malik answered simply when they pressed him, saying, "I don't lead. I sit beside people who have been ignored too long." To him, leadership was not about standing at the front of a room. It was about staying with someone when everyone else walked away, and the world began to notice that perhaps that was the leadership it needed most. The ripple effect spread to schools across the country, where teachers replayed the footage of Malik on the plane, reminding themselves that their students' struggles were not misbehavior, but survival. And parents in support groups shared the clip late at night, crying as they admitted they had sometimes shouted when they should have listened, realizing that empathy was the bridge they had been missing. Even a man from 4D, who had mocked Malik on the plane and called for his removal, found himself humbled months later when his own granddaughter was diagnosed. And he sought out Malik not with arrogance, but with trembling hands, holding a letter and a baseball cap, admitting that he had spoken out of ignorance, and that Malik's words had guided him to listen to his granddaughter in ways he never had before. Malik did not scold him, he did not gloat, he simply asked, "How is she?" And when the man answered, "Better because I started sitting beside her," Malik nodded and said, "That's all it takes." The message was spreading, not through press campaigns or corporate sponsorships, but through people telling each other to pause, to listen, to see. At one school assembly, a young girl stood before her peers and read a poem that ended with the lines, "They said I was broken. He said I was beautiful. They told me to stop. He told me to breathe. I screamed. He stayed." She never said Malik's name. She didn't have to, because everyone knew she meant. And at the back of the gym, Richard and Ethan sat quietly. The boy who once screamed on planes, now writing notes in a small pad, passing one to his father that read, "I want to help someone next." Richard read the words with tears in his eyes, realizing that Malik's legacy was not only a sanctuary, but a seed planted in his own son, a seed that would grow into empathy carried forward. Malik continued to walk the halls of the Johnson Center, never behind a desk or podium, but always on the floor beside the children, drawing with chalk, painting with them, letting them know that their silence was not failure but language, and that someone understood. Volunteers whispered that he should be in education, that he should become a leader, and Malik smiled faintly, replying, "Maybe the world needs quieter leaders." His grandmother Ruth watched with pride, her hands folded over her Bible, knowing that her grandson had transformed his pain into purpose, and that he had done so not by changing himself to fit the world, but by daring to ask the world to change instead. Richard, once a man who measured success by net worth and company growth, now measured it by whether he had sat with his son long enough to understand him. And in public speeches, he no longer spoke of products or profits, but of empathy, telling audiences, "I built machines to connect people, but a boy in a hoodie taught me how to connect with my own child." The world would always remember the viral clip from a flight, but Malik never cared about that, because his true legacy was not a headline or a hashtag, but the quiet moments in the center where a child who had been ignored finally felt safe enough to breathe. And so the story that began at 30,000 feet with judgment, suspicion, and cruelty ended with a message that spread beyond one cabin, beyond one flight, beyond one city. That empathy is not about perfection, not about titles, not about power, but about pausing long enough to listen to those who do not sound like you, to sit beside those the world ignores, and to understand that real change begins not with speeches, but with presence. The end. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'd love to know your thoughts about how the plot unfolded. Was the transformation of Malik and Richard what you expected, or did it surprise you? Tell me in the comments what part of the story struck you the most, and also share where in the world you're watching from. Your voices make these stories more powerful, and I'm reading every single one.